The code compiled successfully, but no one stopped to ask what happens when it runs. We demand transparency from our algorithms, believing that seeing inside the machine will solve our ethical dilemmas. We assume that opening the black box automatically grants us control over its outcomes, yet this clarity can be deceptive, offering a view of the mechanism without addressing its moral weight. Demanding to see how a decision is made feels like progress toward justice. We want explanations, hoping that showing the steps will justify the final destination the system chooses. Technical success is not moral permission. Knowing the exact path an algorithm took to reach a conclusion does not validate the fairness or the ethical legitimacy of that conclusion itself. The promise of transparency is that auditability equals accountability, but this promise confuses description with justification, giving us a map of the process instead of a reason for the outcome. We must question whether explanation has become a substitute for responsibility. An algorithm can explain its steps perfectly while still producing outcomes that violate our shared ethical values. The core problem is that explanation is not accountability. Describing how a system functions does not identify who is responsible when the system causes harm or reinforces systemic biases. Under this design, transparency can act as an ethical shield. Platforms present complex audit trails as proof of responsibility, shifting the burden of evaluation back onto the user. This shift can create a false sense of security. Because we can see the mathematical weights and decision trees, we behave as if the ethical questions have been fully resolved. The stakes are high when clarity breeds complacency. We focus on auditing the technical parameters rather than questioning the institutional choices and incentives that shaped those parameters in the first place. Now, when we substitute transparency for accountability, we let designers off the hook. They can point to an explainable process as proof of diligence, escaping liability for systemic consequences. This dilution of responsibility leaves affected stakeholders with no clear recourse. They receive an explanation of why they were rejected or categorized, but no path to contest the decision. To clarify this problem, we must define algorithmic explanation. It is the technical representation of how inputs are transformed into outputs, designed to make complex computations legible to humans. Accountability, by contrast, is a social relation. It requires not just an explanation, but an agent who must answer for the consequences of a decision and make corrections when needed. The distinction matters between explaining a system and justifying its use. An explanation describes the causal pathway, while justification defends the choice to deploy that pathway in a specific context. Transparency is merely a property of the system architecture. It refers to the visibility of the inner workings, but visibility does not guarantee that anyone is actively steering the system. This visibility can even overwhelm our capacity to evaluate. A flood of complex technical data can obscure the ethical choices embedded in the code, rendering transparency practically useless to observers. We must also define moral complacency in this context. It is the tendency to accept automated outcomes because the process has been labeled as transparent and objective by its creators. When we accept these definitions, we see that explanation is descriptive while accountability is normative. Describing the process does not settle the question of what ought to be allowed. Therefore, demanding transparency without demanding accountability is an incomplete response. It leaves the power dynamics of technology untouched, offering visibility without any mechanism for redistribution of control. The causal mechanism begins with audit trails. By documenting every step of an algorithmic decision, developers create a record that seems to satisfy the demand for ethical oversight. This documentation can convince users that the system is fair. They see a logical flow of rules and weights, which makes the automated outcome feel reasoned and neutral. We built the mirror. In trying to make algorithms transparent, we reflect our desire for order, but we often miss the biases embedded in the original training data and design goals. The explanation system itself is a product of design choices. Developers decide which features to explain and how to present them, shaping the user's understanding of the system's behavior. This presentation can steer attention away from systemic flaws. By highlighting individual factors, the system masks the broader patterns of discrimination that occur across a population of users. Furthermore, explanation models are often approximations. They simplify complex neural networks to make them understandable, which can create a false impression of simplicity and precision in the outcomes. When users trust these simplified explanations, their critical distance decreases. They are less likely to question the system's premise, accepting the automated decision as an objective truth. This decrease in critical distance leads to a loss of human agency. We delegate the task of verification to the explanation interface, assuming it has validated the decision for us. The designer then uses this user trust to deflect criticism. They argue that because the system is transparent, any negative outcomes are simply the logical result of the data provided. This deflection shifts the focus from structural reform to individual input. The user is told to change their behavior, while the underlying algorithmic model remains uncorrected and unchallenged. The system's explanation becomes a final verdict. It explains why a decision occurred, but it does not address whether the decision-making criteria themselves are ethically defensible under current standards. This loop can reinforce existing power asymmetries. Those who build the models control the explanations, while those affected by them must accept the technical justifications without any avenue for appeal. We must notice how this mechanism accumulates ethical debt. Every unexplained harm that is excused by a transparent process adds to a legacy of unaddressed injustice in our automated institutions. Of course, transparency is a necessary condition for accountability, but it is not sufficient. Visibility is the first step, but it must be followed by active evaluation and human judgment. Without this second step, transparency becomes an end in itself. We optimize for explanation quality while ignoring the actual real-world impacts of the decisions the algorithm is making. We must examine the limits of this argument. One defensible position is that transparency is the only practical way to audit systems at scale, providing a baseline for any accountability. Indeed, transparency helps identify outright technical errors. Without explainable models, diagnosing a software bug or a sudden data drift in a deployed system would be virtually impossible for engineers. A rational exception exists in low-stakes environments. When recommendations affect trivial choices like playlist curation, transparency alone is sufficient to help users adjust their preferences without systemic risk. One limitation of this critique is that it depends on user capability. A transparent system is only helpful if the user has the technical literacy to interpret the explanation provided. Conversely, in highly complex domains, demanding full explainability can reduce model accuracy. This creates an unresolved trade-off between the precision of a system and its legibility to humans. A validating case is found in credit scoring. Providing the factors behind a score is transparent, yet it does not solve the fairness of using historical data to predict credit worthiness. These boundaries show that transparency is a tool, not a moral solution. It provides the evidence we need to assign responsibility, but it cannot assign that responsibility for us. To resolve the tension between visibility and responsibility, we must reassert the necessity of human accountability. We cannot let transparent processes excuse designers from the consequences of their code. This means that accountability must be built into the organizational structure. Platforms must establish clear roles and lines of responsibility for the behavior of their automated decision systems. We must move beyond the goal of simple explanation. We must demand justification, forcing institutions to defend the values and assumptions that are coded into their decision-making criteria. We are still responsible. Designers and operators must remain answerable to stakeholders, ensuring that there is always a human agent who can override and correct an automated error. This correction must be accessible. Affected individuals must have a clear path to contest algorithmic decisions with a process that evaluates the fairness of the criteria used. We must also design explanation systems that support active human judgment. Instead of encouraging compliance, explanation should highlight uncertainty and potential biases in the recommended action. By framing transparency as a starting point, we can pay down our ethical debt. we use visibility to enable active critique, transforming passive consumers into active participants in system governance. This shift requires that we prioritize human dignity over system efficiency. We must accept the friction of manual review when automated explanations fail to address unique human circumstances. Ultimately, the goal is to align automated decisions with human values. We must demand governance structures that ensure transparency leads directly to meaningful responsibility and systemic accountability. As a practical application, we can establish frameworks for auditing. When evaluating a new system, we should look past the explanation interface and ask who holds decision-making power. We can also require that developers document their design choices. This documentation should explain not just how the model works, but why specific optimization goals were prioritized over others. The distinction matters. When we evaluate a platform, we must separate technical explainability from ethical legitimacy, ensuring that clarity is never accepted as a substitute for fairness. We should also look for the presence of human appeal mechanisms. A truly accountable system must provide a clear path for users to challenge decisions and receive a human response. Furthermore, we can identify the stakeholders who bear the risks of automated choices. By understanding their concerns, we can design audits that focus on real-world impacts rather than technical metrics. We must also ask who benefits from the current transparency narratives. If disclosure only serves to protect developers from liability, we must demand frameworks that protect the affected users. This approach preserves the unresolved trade-offs of technology. It acknowledges that explanation is helpful, but insists that the final evaluation of legitimacy must remain a human responsibility. By applying these criteria, we can transform transparency from a marketing slogan into a tool for empowerment. We ensure that visibility is always paired with active human accountability. We must not let the clarity of the process blind us to the justice of the outcome. The machine is learning. The question is, what are we teaching it?